Hello, and welcome to Virginia Time Travel, your portal to the Commonwealth's past, present, and future. The image of George Washington is one of the most famous images throughout the nation's history. Every time we have seen the man, it has more often than not inspired something within us in order to achieve something we have never been able to do before. His life story is one that every school child within the nation has heard of, most specifically, the cherry tree. But while we certainly have these grandeur images of Washington, those that will certainly set him above the rest, there is, of course, another side of the man, a side which is oftentimes forgotten about and usually underscored. And that aspect to him is the day-to-day George Washington, the man who actually lived in Virginia, the man who did business, who would go to parties, who would, in his younger days, woo young women in order to go ahead and find himself one day a wife. This is a man who is oftentimes forgotten. And so today, I'm joined by sometimes co-host and author Charles Mills in order to discuss the real George Washington. So, welcome back.
Well, thank you. And yeah, it is interesting to think that had the Revolution not come along, George Washington would have just been another Virginia farmer with the same concerns as his neighbors. But George Washington actually got off to a pretty rocky start, even as a child.
Well, he did. I mean, when you think about the life of Washington, and here he is. He's the third son to his father. His father had been married before, had two children, Lawrence and Augustine. And now here comes George as the first son of the second marriage. And at the tender age of 10, right when he is ripening at this point to what would be considered a colonial young man, his father's gone. And here comes the reading of the will. Lawrence gets the #1 land of Hunting Creek. Augustine will get the second best land. And here comes George, who's going to get Little Ferry Farm down off of Fredericksburg by the Chotank. I mean, there you go. And even his mother, Mary Ball, had complained, why is it me, the current widow, with her eldest son, gets the third-rated land?
And not only that, he kind of got a second-rate education compared to his older brothers, didn't he?
Well, the education itself is, we could argue it's second-rated. It was Augustine's full intention to send Washington to the University of Edinburgh, where he had gone. He had sent both of the older boys there, and had Augustine lived a couple more years, most likely by the age of 14, Washington himself would have gone to Edinburgh, in which case, who knows what kind of man would have developed there. He would have been in England. Perhaps the love and loyalty to the crown would have been far more suited to him, and so it certainly would have been there. His education, though, as a child, certainly was lacking, but his skills in mathematics had been greatly improved upon. And it seemed to be one area he was very good at, and so becoming a surveyor certainly seemed in the cards as a young boy, but I think for Washington, the idea of being a military man was very much instilled in him as well.
So now, would you say that Washington was pretty much self-educated? I mean, one of the things that's amazing about our founding fathers is that many of them, were not college graduates. They were really kind of self-educated men.
Well, yes, that's true. I mean, in a lot of ways, they are self-educated. If you compare Washington to his contemporaries, this is certainly true. Probably the best contemporary to compare him to would be Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry lived in the Shenandoah Valley, and here's close to the Shenandoah Valley, I should say, excuse me. But Patrick Henry himself did multiple jobs before he finally settled as a lawyer, and at this time, to actually become a member of society with a very good job. For instance, we think of lawyers today. We know you have to go to law school. You must go ahead and have an internship. You go through years worth of rigorous training before you become a lawyer and pass the bar. Well, in Washington's day, to become a lawyer, you had to read a couple of law books. You were tested by 3 lawyers in the state or in the colony at the time, and boom, you're a lawyer. Simple as that.
So how did Washington get his surveyor skills?
Well, as a surveyor, Washington showed initial skills in mathematics. He first went ahead and drew out a map in detail of Ferry Farm in Fredericksburg. And a surveyor had gotten a look at it, and sure enough, it was dead on. All the calculations were accurate, and so Washington was apprenticed as a surveyor. And Washington would go ahead and take this role as surveyor, And at age 17, he would be responsible for the plot laying out of Alexandria, Virginia, designing the entire town and creating, at least in the Old Town portion, you notice that the city blocks there are perfect 90-degree squares. And he designed it specifically on the notion that as you expand the town, create another 90-degree square, and you will be able to build the town out symmetrically in every direction.
So here he is, 17 years old. Looks like his primary motivation was self-improvement, self-betterment.
Well, self-betterment is certainly there. One of the things Washington was very adamant about was following the rules of civility, which was a series of about 110 rules designed specifically for a young gentleman to act properly in society. He had memorized every single one of them. He certainly knew how to try to make himself become part of the role. And it also didn't help that his education was finished off by the Fairfax family. Now, the Fairfax family was the richest family in all of Virginia. They were connected to the Washingtons thanks to Lawrence Washington, who had married into the family. And so Lawrence would go to Belvoir Plantation. George would sometimes be an individual who would join him. And so he would learn all of the necessary tools for refinement when it came to acting properly in society. And it worked out pretty well in his favor. From 17 to 21, this is a young man who will go ahead and earn a great deal of land. He will become the surveyor of Culpeper County. He will also become a major in the Virginia militia. And by 21 years of age, he is an up-and-coming man in society in Virginia.
So now Lawrence was the eldest brother.
Yes.
And he died prematurely, leaving Washington, Mount Vernon. The Mount Vernon we associate with Washington today.
Not quite. You see, the thing is that Mount Vernon technically did not belong to Washington for the longest time because Lawrence died but left a widow. And so the widow Washington, it becomes the proprietor. But George understood that Mount Vernon is a fine estate. It has great potential. For a man like himself on the rise, it is something he would want to do, so he would want to have. And so Washington, this is definitely an episode of his keen awareness of striking while you can. And so he approached Colonel Fairfax, who was the father of the widow Washington, and he said, "Sir, I realize that at this distressing time it may seem improper, but I would like to rent Mount Vernon from you, specifically your daughter. But women are not allowed to hold property. They must be a man, so the father naturally would be the beneficiary." And so the father said, "All right, well, here's what we will do. As you know, there are children that had survived, and so if the children live before the mother dies, then they will own Mount Vernon. But if the children die and the mother dies, Mount Vernon will become yours. And in the meantime, you shall be caretaker." Well, Washington lucked out. All connection to his brother Lawrence died out, so he becomes the sole proprietor. And so it really is kind of keeping your hedging your bets that you might be able to do it. All the while, he, I believe, had zero intention of leaving Mount Vernon, even if somebody tried to claim it was going to be theirs. He was improving the house, he was expanding the house, he was working on the fields, trying to improve everything. I don't think he would have let go of the house under any circumstance. I think he would have played the gender card and probably could have won it.
Well, now he did a lot of innovative things at Mount Vernon. Now, I know you've worked at the distillery. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
The distillery is a late-in-life creation for Mount Vernon. It comes from James Anderson, who was a master distiller, and he came to us from Scotland. And when he arrived here in Virginia, he wanted to work for Washington. He saw that Washington was a very adventurous businessman, and so he was hired on initially as a farm manager for Dogue Farm, which is located next to Fort Belvoir today. And if you're at the intersection of Route 1 and I think it's 236 is the route number, but it's the old Mount Vernon Highway, that's the street name. Dogue Farm is located right there, and what's left of it at least. And one of the things that happened was Anderson couldn't help but notice that the farm was a prime location for a distillery, and that distilleries could make a great deal of money. But Washington, by this point in his life, it's 1798. It's getting pretty close to the end of his life, as we know. But this is a man who is 66 years of age. He's a little hesitant on getting in on a new business. But once he sees the profits are there, he goes in full force, builds the largest distillery in the nation at the time, which held 5 stills. And in 1799, he will produce approximately 11,000 gallons of whiskey. And you know what? It's important to remember this, because if you watch the History Channel's President series, after they finish with Washington, they make a little comment. They make a mistake in saying it was 1798 that he made 11,000, but it wasn't. It was 1799, because in 98 he only produced 4,000 gallons worth of whiskey. And so the History Channel, apparently the fact checkers were a little asleep on the watch there, but he became the largest distiller in America, and had he lived a little bit longer, we might be having, as I like to say, Virginia sipping whiskey and not Tennessee sipping whiskey.
Now, the distillery is located right there with the grist mill.
Yes.
What's the story about the grist mill?
The grist mill that you see today is actually a 4-story structure. It is a grist mill originally from the Shenandoah Valley, and it was transplanted over rock by rock. And the reason why is because this particular grist mill just happened to be the right dimension size of the Washington one. According to all records, the Washington grist mill was only a 3-story structure, so you would have had the lowest level, which is somewhat obscured by the hill, a second, and then a main level, and then an upper level, which would have been the roof. So it wouldn't have been that impressive a structure. Now, what made this one is that this makes Washington a merchant miller. He had two sets of stones to grind. The first one was a country stone, which would have ground up anything under the sun. And the second would be a French burr stone, which is specifically designed for wheat. Now, in doing wheat, Washington will take advantage of his presidential office at the time, and he probably wouldn't have been able to have the clout and influence to do this had he not been president. But he will go ahead and call upon a gentleman by the name of Evans, Oliver Evans to be precise. And Oliver Evans created a system wherein he automated the milling process for the grinding and the producing of wheat flour. And so in doing this, Washington would invest in this particular program. And today's grist mill is the only one, at least as far as I know of, that has a fully operating Evans system. But as you know, you and I went to an old abandoned grist mill, saw it virtually destroyed, but it too had the makings of an early Evans system involved as well, and looking at the gears. And so it's unique to see how it was a very popular tool and a system that stayed in fact in operation until the invention of the turbine.
Well, had Washington not been president and a successful general, he still would have been an amazing man, because he was always doing innovative things. He wanted America to become the granary of the world. And certainly one of the most interesting things he did at Mount Vernon was the creation of this 16-sided barn, which was, what's the deal with that?
The 16-sided barn has multiple purposes to it. Part of it is, of course, storage of food materials. You can also put the animals in there to keep them warm in the winter. But one of the amazing things is that you have these heavy horses coming in, and as they're walking around, one of the things they did was that when you harvest wheat, you need to get the seeds out of there. And the only way they could get the seeds out was to basically try to pick them out or mash them out. And the best way to mash them out was with these horse hooves. As they would walk about, it would hit the ground, and it would start to shake out all the grain, all the seeds. And so this is what would create the flour. And so because of this, it was a very innovative invention. Now, the 16-sided barn has, as far as we know, was originally located at Doak Farm as well. And so most of the innovative technology that Washington created would have been in the outlying farms. It wouldn't have actually been at Mansion Farm where he lived, because that would have been making it too crowded. Instead, it would have been located out at Doak Farm or any of the other ones.
So these are like little research labs.
More or less. You could argue it's a research lab. Washington was always one to try different things. He was willing, as long as it showed the benefit of profit.
And this 16-sided barn, it had a way of automating the this process, right?
Well, it had it had the opportunity to automate a little bit. I mean, it was literally horse powered.
Well, yeah, but
And so, I mean, you don't have to worry about sending, say, a group of slaves in there to push everything around. So you have a horse doing it. And a horse can go a lot longer than a human being can. I mean, as long as you put a feed bag on its mouth and give it the occasional bit of water, it's in great shape.
and he was one of the first ones to use mules, wasn't he?
Mules were used. Mules were discovered to actually be pretty good animals. In fact, there is an ironic little twist that says the United States never lost a war where mules were involved. And so the funny thing is that everyone's going to stop and think about that for a second. They realize, wait a minute, they're right. We never did lose a war so long as we had a mule. But mules, they proved to be very good pack animals.
Well, not only that, but they were called the 18th century tractor.
Well, yes, they could pull they could go ahead and pull along your nice little
Plow.
Plow. Thank you. Had a little memory lapse there. And so you pull your plow, and the funny thing is that the plows, they're very temperamental at the time. In fact, this first steel plow is John Deere.
Really?
That's the first steel plow. If it wasn't for John Deere, we wouldn't have had. We would have had mostly a wooden part, and it's only the little metal where you break the ground. That's it. Everything else is wood.
Well, when was that invented?
John Deere doesn't come around until the 1870s.
So Washington's people are using like wooden plows?
Mm-hmm. It's a wooden plow. It's a tried and true method, dating all the way back to antiquity. In fact, in antiquity, he didn't even use a horse; he used a man. You latch the ropes onto him, and he just tugs until finally they get to the end.
Now, another thing he innovated was a commercial fishery.
Fisheries were very important for the time. In fact, fisheries also helped a lot of ways. If you have a bad growing season, river's got fish in it, catch the fish, you're in great shape. You can go ahead and sell that to market and make a decent price, especially if the cost of grain is going up and you can't really sell it, sell fish. You can make up the income there. In addition to that, if you catch enough fish and you have some extra supply, you can always have it for dinner yourself, or feed off, or Washington sends to the slaves and feed it there. And of course, you got to remember, fish, once you take the fillets off, you've got those bones, the head and the tail. What do you do with it? Plant it. Throw the fish into the ground, throw some corn seed in there, and there you go.
And Washington, unlike his neighbors, kind of turned his back on tobacco, didn't he?
Not quite. Washington did not turn his back on tobacco on all the other land holdings he had thanks to his marriage to Martha. Washington wanted Mount Vernon to be the center of his tobacco capital. Problem is, if you know anything about Northern Virginia soil, the soil here is exceptionally hard and very stiff. And so it's not the kind of soil you want to grow tobacco in. You're going to need soft soil, deep, rich earth. That's further south in western Virginia, not in northern Virginia. And so Washington grudgingly had to let go of tobacco, but a lot of it was also because of British intervention with taxation and the fact that he was going into massive debt, and he didn't like the idea of being in debt. And so he worked very hard to pull himself out of it, and did it too. He was the only founding father not to die in debt.
Well, certainly founding fathers would be right at home in today's economy.
Well, in today's economy, I think the founding fathers would certainly say, we can spend our way out of it if need be. They could certainly argue that, but then again, I think Washington, his own frugality would say, perhaps we should start saving a few more of our pennies.
Now, in many ways, it's amazing that Mount Vernon is still with us today because, obviously he was a rebel general, and you had the British all over this area during both the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. So how is it that Mount Vernon wasn't burned to the ground by the British?
Luck.
In one of those wars.
Luck. A lot of it's luck. Reason why it wasn't burned in 1812, it's a lot easier to answer. The British had a great reverence towards Washington. In fact, it has been recorded that when Commodore James Gordon and his small flotilla fleet sailed up the Potomac as they were going by Mount Vernon, they gave passing honors in recognition of Washington, even though he was the father of the enemy nation. The British had a great respect towards the man, and so they were willing to go ahead and leave that be. In addition to that, Mount Vernon is private property. It's not public property. British are known for not wanting to destroy private property. Every officer sees himself as a gentleman first, and so they would refuse to. During the Revolution, there's the famous incident of a British warship coming up to Mount Vernon, coming ashore and demanding refreshments. They received their refreshments from Lund, Washington, and when that happened, some slaves had jumped on board, said they wanted their freedom, and the British, by law, gave them their freedom. And here's Lund saying, okay. And when he writes to Washington, Washington says, I would have wished the British burned my house rather than you saving it, but I understand what you did. Reality, I think an unsung moment in history would have been probably Washington's return to Mount Vernon, his first time seeing Lund. He pulls him to the study and says, thank you. Because I think Washington would have hated seeing Mount Vernon burned to the ground and all of his hard work being destroyed by fire.
Now, a lot of people will remember the movie National Treasure and the so-called secret vaults and passages under Mount Vernon. Is there any truth to that?
Not a one. There isn't.
Well, now they do a National Treasure tour at Mount Vernon.
Oh, of course you do a tour. Anyone can do a tour. I mean, if it's a hot Hollywood film, people are excited about it. Of course you're going to do a tour about it. You're going to want to do it. I mean, when Remember the Titans came out, everyone wanted to see T.C. Williams High School. Everyone wanted to see the football field. Everyone wanted to see Alexandria. Everyone wanted to see where these guys were at. Guess what? Disney went to Barrett Library in Alexandria, Virginia. They went to their local history. They broke down every conceivable thing and made sure that every restaurant ever mentioned in that movie didn't exist. Okay? They made sure of that. They changed the history of T.C. Williams around specifically for the role of film. And so for Mount Vernon, yes, they will take you downstairs into the basement. Yes, you will go ahead and see the wine cellars where they kept all the barrels of wine. Yes, you can see the little portal where the film went into. But when you shove against that wall, guess what? If you take a running start, you're going to break your shoulder because it's just a wall.
I see. Okay. Interesting. What about some of the interesting personalities that might have shown up at Mount Vernon over the years during Washington's lifetime?
Oh, there's plenty of personalities. There's Henry, there's the Houdon, Henry Houdon, who did the bust of Washington.
Was he an American?
No, he's a Frenchman. He's a Frenchman who came over. He wanted to do a bust of Washington. He was commissioned by the Marquis de Lafayette to go ahead and do this. And so there's a famous incident where little Nellie Custis came into the study and saw her grandfather laid out on a table. She thought he had died. And there he is. His face is covered in plaster, and he's got these little straws in his nostrils. And imagine a little girl like this seeing her grandpapa being laid out like that. And so Houdon says, "Oh no, he's fine. Don't worry, little girl." And so he shows the mask. He says, "This shall be the greatest bust ever." And so the bust is said to be the most lifelike image of Washington ever made. When Lafayette came in 1824, he saw the bust of Houdon in Mount Vernon, and the famous quote he said is, "There is my general."
And how old was he?
At this time, Washington at this point would have been just about late 50s, early 60s. And so
this was when he was president?
This would have been around presidential, close to post-presidential time, but most likely definitely presidential lifetime at this point.
Okay, interesting. Now, the Marquis de Lafayette was almost like a son to Washington, wasn't he?
Virtually a son. In fact, Nellie Custis referred to Lafayette as her French father. Lafayette always looked upon the Washington grandchildren almost like his own. Washington looked upon Lafayette as a son. I think Martha probably wished she could have had a son like Lafayette because of the way the connection was there. Lafayette was a man who greatly admired and loved Washington, and this was...
Lafayette even named his son George Washington Lafayette.
Yes, he did. In fact, many people named their sons after Washington for various reasons, and so certainly Washington was the key critical man.
Now, was he a frequent visitor to Mount Vernon?
No, he only visited a handful of times. The last time was his tour in 1824, and he did one last little visit in 1825. And before that, there was an American tour in the 1790s. During the Revolution, he would go by. There's one mysterious time, though, where he went to Mount Vernon. He knew Mrs. Washington wasn't there. He knew General Washington wasn't there. There's no real written record as to why he went. And so it's a hotly debated issue, at least for some folks who look for scandal wherever they can. And so it kind of makes you wonder just a little bit.
So now there's a key to the Bastille at Mount Vernon. Was that?
That was a gift from Lafayette, and it was meant to show liberty itself in action in France. And so, once again, we find ourselves in a precarious position because we've just run out of time. And lo and behold, talking about George Washington between the two of us is something that can go on literally for hours. If Virginia Time Travel ever wanted to do a very long show, we have a man to go ahead and talk about, and we would never run out of steam. But to learn more about George Washington and his life and everything else that has happened with him, visit our website at www.timetravel21.com or email us at timetravel21@yahoo.com. This has been Virginia Time Travel, your portal to the Commonwealth's past, present, and future. Thank you for tuning in, and we can't wait to go back in time with you once again.